The landlady asked me to stay, and in that quiet room, everything changed. The day started with the usual mix of curiosity and hesitation, though something about this particular visit felt different. Stepping up to the landlady's house, the young man noticed how the late afternoon sunlight filtered through the old oak trees, casting long, gentle shadows across the cobblestone path. The air carried the faint scent of earth and something sweeter, perhaps a hint of flowers from her small front garden. Every detail seemed heightened, as if the house itself anticipated his arrival. The door opened before he could knock, revealing the landlady in all her composed elegance. She was confident, graceful, a woman who seemed to command the space simply by being in it. Her presence was warm but unassuming, like sunlight spilling across polished wood floors. The way she held herself, poised yet relaxed, suggested a life of experience and quiet assurance. Her smile, brief yet genuine, made him feel immediately seen, as if his nervousness had not gone unnoticed. There was no judgment in her eyes, only a soft curiosity that drew him in. The interior of the house was cozy, filled with a lived-in warmth. Soft curtains rippled in the breeze, the faint ticking of an antique clock punctuated the quiet, and the polished wood of the floors reflected a golden glow from the late sun. Each object seemed to carry a story: a vase slightly chipped at the rim, photographs arranged carefully on a shelf, a small stack of books resting near a window. The young man found himself absorbing these details, feeling an odd mixture of admiration and awe. It was a space that suggested both comfort and quiet mystery, much like the woman who had welcomed him in. As he stepped inside, the landlady's gaze lingered for a fraction longer than necessary, and for the first time, he felt the subtle tension that would thread through the rest of their encounter. It was not an overtly romantic tension, it was something quieter, a pull of awareness, the sense that both of them were conscious of each other in a way that went beyond polite interaction. She gestured lightly toward a chair, her hand brushing the air, her movements fluid and unhurried. It was a simple invitation, yet it carried weight: stay a while, observe, notice. The young man noticed the contrast between her confident demeanor and the warmth that seemed to radiate in small, unspoken gestures. The way her eyes softened when she smiled, the slight tilt of her head as she listened. For a moment he felt both out of place and completely at home, a curious paradox that left him silent. Each sound, the creak of the floorboards, the faint rustle of her clothing, the soft hum of distant traffic, felt heightened in this quiet, sunlit room. There was something magnetic about the way she occupied the space, her quiet authority, the subtle grace in her posture, and the warmth that softened the edges of formality. He felt a pull to stay, to linger in this delicate balance of observation and invitation. It was an arrival that promised more than a simple visit. It hinted at connection, understanding, and perhaps, the beginning of something quietly extraordinary. After the initial greetings and the subtle weight of first impressions, the young man found himself lingering in the living room, the warmth of the house wrapping around him like a quiet reassurance. The landlady, noticing his hesitation, offered a simple, casual suggestion. "Why don't you stay a while?" The words were soft, almost offhand, but there was an unspoken depth to them. They weren't merely an invitation to remain physically in the room, they carried the promise of conversation, observation, and shared presence. He paused, the offer settling in his chest like a delicate weight. Staying felt like a step into something unfamiliar, yet strangely compelling. There was the age gap, the social awareness of propriety, the unspoken rules of visiting a landlady's home, all of it tugging at the corners of his consciousness. And yet there was something about her presence that made the hesitation bearable. Her voice, calm and gentle, carried no pressure, only an understated expectation that he might let himself be at ease. As he moved to accept the invitation, he became aware of the small, intimate details of the space around him. The couch he sank into was soft, worn just enough to be comfortable, the fabric carrying the faint scent of lavender and old books. The landlady moved around the room with an unhurried grace, her hands gesturing lightly as she spoke. When she extended her arm to point toward the window, his fingers brushed hers briefly, a fleeting contact that lingered in his mind longer than it did on his skin. It was the kind of touch that communicated care without expectation, subtle yet undeniably intimate. The emotional undercurrent of the moment was a mixture of comfort and intrigue. He felt both observed and accepted, as if she were quietly reading the nuances of his reaction, while simultaneously inviting him to relax and simply exist in the space she had carefully curated. Her eyes held a softness that contrasted beautifully with her quiet authority, and in those moments, he felt the pull of admiration deepening into curiosity, and curiosity beginning to brush against the edges of attraction. Conversation flowed naturally, though carefully, like a gentle stream navigating around stones. She asked questions that revealed genuine interest in his thoughts, his perspective, without prying. The way she listened, the slight tilt of her head, the way her eyes softened when he spoke, made him aware of the unspoken connection forming between them. There was a rhythm in the quiet of the room, the distant hum of traffic, the soft rustle of curtains, and the subtle cadence of their exchanged words, all blending into a comforting, almost hypnotic atmosphere. He realized, in the quiet moments between conversation and gesture, that this invitation to stay was more than hospitality. It was a test of patience and observation, a gentle drawing in that respected boundaries while hinting at deeper understanding. The landlady's calm composure and attentive gestures created a space where he could feel both grounded and gently unsettled, the exact mixture that allowed admiration to simmer into a subtle, slow-burn tension. As he settled more comfortably on the couch, he became acutely aware of the warmth in the room, the nuanced scent of tea and flowers, and the soft presence of the landlady nearby. It was a moment suspended between familiarity and anticipation, a delicate balance that promised the beginning of a connection far richer than mere conversation. Staying, he realized, might change everything, in ways he was only beginning to understand. Just as the young man was beginning to settle into the gentle rhythm of the living room, the door opened again, letting in a breeze that carried a faint hint of fresh flowers and the outside world. The landlady's cousin entered, a woman close in age to the landlady, moving with a grace that complemented her presence. She carried a small tray of tea, the delicate china cups clinking softly as she approached. Her movements were smooth, practiced, almost ritualistic, but there was warmth in her smile, a sense of quiet attentiveness that immediately drew the young man's notice. The moment she stepped inside, the atmosphere shifted slightly. The landlady, who had radiated calm authority until now, seemed to subtly adjust her posture, her eyes flicking to the cousin in a way that suggested familiarity, but also a protective attentiveness. There was an unspoken dance between the two women, a rhythm of glances, subtle gestures, and shared understanding. The young man felt the shift keenly, an unarticulated awareness that he was now observing a dynamic richer and more layered than he had anticipated. As the cousin moved around the room, pouring the tea with precise, deliberate care, the young man noticed the tiny sensory details, the faint aroma of freshly brewed leaves, the delicate warmth of the porcelain cup as it was set down, the soft rustle of fabric with each step she took. Every small motion seemed imbued with intention, drawing his attention in a way that felt almost magnetic. It was impossible not to compare her calm elegance with the landlady's quiet authority, two different forms of grace coexisting in the same space, each highlighting the other. The young man's awareness of subtle social boundaries heightened. He felt a faint twinge of exclusion as he watched the cousin serve tea, aware of how the landlady's eyes followed her, a mixture of pride, fondness, and perhaps something more intimate. It was not jealousy in the conventional sense, but rather the awareness that these women shared a bond, one built on years of familiarity and mutual respect. His curiosity and admiration for the landlady deepened, tempered by the understanding that he was now an observer of a nuanced connection, delicate yet full of unspoken depth. Conversation resumed, now threefold. The cousin's presence added texture to the dialogue, a lightness that contrasted with the landlady's quiet depth. She asked questions, offered small anecdotes, and her laughter, soft and unforced, filled the room in a way that felt natural and comforting. Yet the young man noticed the landlady's subtle cues, the way her gaze lingered slightly longer on him, the faint smile tugging at her lips when their eyes met. These micro-moments suggested an emotional depth that the cousin, though charming and engaging, did not quite replicate. Sensory awareness heightened, the soft hum of the heating system, the gentle click of teaspoons against china, the warmth radiating from the tea itself, and the shared space between the three of them. Every glance, every gesture seemed charged with quiet meaning. The young man realized that the presence of the cousin, while seemingly casual, added layers to the emotional landscape, subtle tension, heightened awareness, and the first stirrings of protective admiration for the landlady. By the time the tea was poured and settled into their hands, the young man felt both intrigued and slightly overwhelmed. He was drawn not only to the landlady but now to the complex, graceful dynamic between the two women. It was a living tableau of attention, care, and subtle intimacy, and he knew instinctively that he had stepped into a moment that would shape his understanding of connection in ways he could not yet fully articulate. Once the initial formality of tea had settled into the room, the young man found himself relaxing slightly, though his awareness of the landlady remained acute. She had a way of listening that made each word feel significant, as if the pauses between them were just as important as the sentences themselves. Her voice was soft, deliberate, carrying a warmth that invited trust. He felt drawn into her world, a space that felt safe yet charged with quiet tension, the kind that makes each glance and gesture feel meaningful. The conversation began simply, with questions about his studies and work, yet it gradually deepened, evolving into topics that revealed more than surface-level information. She asked about his experiences, his perspective on small, everyday matters, and even about the emotions that accompanied them. Her eyes, attentive and warm, seemed to encourage honesty without ever forcing it. Every time he spoke, he noticed the slight tilt of her head, the soft lift of her eyebrows, the way her lips curved in understanding or amusement. Small gestures, a hand brushing a stray strand of hair from her face, the gentle tapping of a finger against her teacup, created an intimacy that went beyond words. The young man became acutely aware of the subtle energy between them. There were moments when their eyes would meet and linger just a fraction longer than socially expected. In those fractions of time, he sensed her curiosity, her attentiveness, and something else, a quiet approval, almost as if she recognized his hesitation and valued the sincerity behind it. She allowed silences to hang comfortably, knowing that in those pauses, emotions often spoke louder than conversation ever could. The cousin, meanwhile, continued her attentive presence, filling the room with polite laughter and occasional commentary. But the young man noticed the landlady's focus, the micro-expressions, the slight shifts in posture, the way she adjusted the teacup in her hands, all subtle cues that drew him into a private rhythm between them. There was a push and pull, a silent dance of awareness and restraint, where every gesture conveyed meaning without violating propriety. Sensory details enriched the connection. The faint steam rising from the teacups carried the delicate scent of jasmine, mingling with the subtle aroma of her perfume. The warmth radiating from the tea seemed to extend to the space between them, comforting and inviting. The soft creak of the couch under his shifting weight, the rustle of skirts, the faint ticking of the antique clock, each sound layered into an atmosphere thick with awareness and potential. He felt his own nervousness ease, replaced by admiration and a subtle desire to remain in this moment indefinitely. She had the ability to make him feel both observed and accepted, challenged and reassured. It was in these exchanges, through questions and shared smiles, that a foundation was laid, one of trust, quiet intimacy, and the promise of deeper emotional connection. By the end of their conversation, the young man realized that the landlady's presence had an almost magnetic effect. He was drawn not only to her grace and warmth but to the way she could make ordinary dialogue feel charged with meaning. This was more than casual interaction, It was the slow, deliberate weaving of understanding and attraction, a delicate tapestry that would guide the rest of their encounter. As the conversation continued, the young man became increasingly aware of the small gestures that filled the space between words. The landlady's presence was commanding yet gentle, and there was a rhythm in the room that seemed to anticipate subtle movement. When he reached for the sugar to stir his tea, his fingers brushed hers ever so lightly. It was a fleeting contact, barely noticeable, yet it sent a ripple through his chest, an unexpected warmth that lingered far longer than the touch itself. She did not pull away. Instead, her hand remained momentarily, her eyes lifting to meet his with a soft, knowing gaze. There was no awkwardness, no pressure, only a quiet acknowledgement of the moment, a silent communication that spoke volumes without a single word. The brush of her skin against his sparked a heightened awareness of proximity, the kind of subtle intimacy that builds tension without needing to be spoken aloud. It was both thrilling and comforting, a paradox that made him acutely conscious of every detail in the room. The young man's heart beat slightly faster, yet the atmosphere remained warm, inviting, and safe. He noticed the softness of her hand, the gentle texture of her skin, the way her fingers moved with effortless grace as she withdrew slightly to resume her teacup. Every micro-movement felt deliberate, creating a rhythm that deepened the connection between them. It was not just the touch itself but the intention behind it, the way she allowed it, acknowledged it, and made it meaningful without overstepping boundaries. Their eyes met again, and in that glance, he felt an understanding blossom, admiration mixed with curiosity, desire tempered by respect. Her subtle gestures, a gentle brush of hair from her shoulder, the careful placement of her teacup, the soft tilt of her head, were all cues that invited attention without demanding it. He found himself noticing the warmth radiating from her presence, the quiet steadiness in the way she held herself, and the unspoken encouragement in her smile. It was an intimacy that thrived on restraint, patience, and observation. The cousin, pouring the last of the tea, remained an unobtrusive presence in the room, her actions adding a sense of domestic normalcy that contrasted with the growing tension between the young man and the landlady. It was in this juxtaposition, the ordinary and the subtly extraordinary, that the young man felt the depth of his admiration for the landlady grow. He was drawn not just to her grace and warmth, but to the way she could create space for connection, a delicate balance of closeness and propriety. The room seemed to contract in these quiet moments, every sound amplified, the soft clink of china, the rustle of clothing, the faint ticking of the clock, the subtle hum of conversation. And yet, amidst all this ordinary detail, the brush of her fingers against his hand remained the focal point, a signal that intimacy could exist without words or declarations. In that gentle, fleeting touch, a bridge was formed, one of trust, curiosity, and the beginnings of a connection that promised more than casual acquaintance. The young man understood that this was a slow-burn romance, unfolding in gestures and glances, in silences that spoke louder than words. It was a moment that would linger in memory, quietly shaping the trajectory of everything yet to come. As the afternoon wore on, the room seemed to settle into a quiet intimacy that transcended words. The young man and the landlady sat close, their chairs angled toward each other in a subtle choreography of attention. The cousin, still attentive and polite, had begun tidying up nearby, leaving them small pockets of private space where conversation could drift into deeper, more personal waters. The young man sensed that the moment had shifted. Their dialogue was no longer simply about daily life or casual observations. There was a depth forming, a careful layering of vulnerability that demanded attention. The landlady began to share a story from her past, one tinged with gentle melancholy and quiet reflection. She spoke of moments when she had felt lonely, of experiences that had shaped her understanding of connection and trust. Her voice was calm, but there was a tremor of emotion beneath the surface, a delicate vulnerability that made her presence all the more magnetic. The young man listened intently, noticing the subtle shifts in her expression, the softening of her eyes, the faint crease at the corner of her lips, the way her fingers lightly traced the rim of her teacup. Each gesture seemed to underscore the sincerity of her words. In this moment, he realized that attraction could exist in layers far subtler than the obvious. It was not the type of desire that needed to be confessed aloud. It was quiet, simmering, an unspoken understanding that connected them across the space between words. His admiration for her grace, her intelligence, and the vulnerability she allowed to peek through the veneer of confidence deepened into something more intimate, a slow, cautious yearning tempered by respect. Sensory details heightened the intimacy. The faint aroma of tea, mingled with her subtle perfume, filled the air. The sunlight filtering through the curtains painted gentle patterns across the floor. The soft rustle of her clothing punctuated the silence that lingered between sentences. Every small movement, every fleeting glance, carried weight. When she paused to sip her tea, he found himself aware of the warmth radiating from her hands, the steady rhythm of her heartbeat, and the unspoken comfort of shared quiet. He felt protective, drawn to her presence in a way that went beyond simple admiration. There was an emotional gravity, a sense that understanding her fully would require patience, care, and attentiveness. He wanted to linger in the space she had created, to listen, to respond with sensitivity, and to honor the vulnerability she had entrusted to him. There was a silent dialogue unfolding, one in which emotions were communicated through glances, pauses, and subtle gestures rather than words. Even as the cousin moved about the room, tidying and pouring more tea, the young man and the landlady remained tethered in this intimate rhythm. A shared look, a faint smile, a soft sigh, each subtle action reinforced the bond forming between them. It was a quiet confession, an acknowledgement that their connection had deepened beyond casual acquaintance. Both understood, without speaking, that something significant had begun, a slow-burning emotional intimacy that would guide the final chapter of their encounter. By the time the conversation wound down, the young man felt a profound awareness of her presence, not only the elegance and confidence she exuded, but the quiet vulnerability and depth that made her truly magnetic. This moment of implied emotional confession set the stage for the warmth and resolution that would follow, leaving the story poised on the brink of a meaningful, YouTube-safe romantic culmination. As the afternoon light began to soften, spilling golden hues across the room, the young man realized that time had slipped by almost unnoticed. The teacups, now empty, sat gently on the table, a quiet testament to the hours of conversation, laughter, and subtle connection that had unfolded. The landlady's presence, steady and warm, had guided him through an emotional journey he hadn't anticipated. Their exchanges, layered with glances, pauses, and gestures, had woven a tapestry of trust and understanding, leaving him both exhilarated and contemplative. The cousin, sensing the natural close of the visit, began to move toward the door with a polite smile, collecting the empty teacups and tidying the space. Her presence, though graceful and engaging, now seemed to amplify the private rhythm that had developed between the young man and the landlady. In the quiet left behind, he became acutely aware of the subtle warmth of her presence, the softness in her gaze, and the calm confidence that had both invited and challenged him throughout the afternoon. When it was finally time to leave, the landlady rose gracefully and moved toward him. There was a gentle steadiness in her movement, a quiet acknowledgement of the bond that had formed over the hours. As he stood, she extended a hand, not as a formality, but as a gesture imbued with connection. Their hands met briefly, her touch warm and grounding, conveying a mixture of reassurance and promise. In that instant, he felt the full weight of the afternoon, the shared silences, the fleeting touches, the glances that lingered just long enough to speak volumes. Her eyes held him for a moment longer than necessary, soft yet expressive, communicating trust, curiosity, and an unspoken understanding of the slow-burn connection that had formed between them. It was a glance that made him realize that the emotional intimacy they had nurtured was mutual, delicate yet undeniable. Even the air between them seemed charged with quiet significance, a recognition that what had begun was more than casual acquaintance, and that both of them were aware of its subtle but profound impact. The young man took a step toward the door, then paused. There was a fleeting moment when the ordinary act of saying goodbye felt monumental, heavy with unsaid words and emotions. She offered a small, knowing smile, a gesture that conveyed both warmth and encouragement, leaving him with the sense that this farewell was temporary, a pause in an ongoing journey rather than a conclusion. As he stepped outside, the soft rustle of leaves in the late afternoon breeze and the distant hum of life beyond the house reminded him of the world outside, yet the warmth of her presence lingered. The aroma of tea, mingled with the faint trace of her perfume, followed him just enough to keep the memory vivid. He felt a sense of quiet satisfaction, a calm understanding that this encounter had shifted something fundamental, a slow-burning connection, respectful and meaningful, now etched into his awareness. By the time he walked away from the house, he carried with him a deep appreciation for her grace, her warmth, and the subtle intimacy they had shared. It was an ending that felt complete, yet it hinted at future moments of connection, a gentle promise that the bond they had nurtured over tea and conversation would continue to grow. The young man left not with longing, but with a quiet certainty. Something meaningful had begun, and the memory of this afternoon would remain a guiding warmth in the days to come.